Translators note Eric Prenowitz right on a meme 2 fautradur etil faut ne patradur. 1 customs officer, judge, and executor, mountebank medium, impassive impostor, forger of authority, illiberal host, and ungracious guest. The translator should never really be there. Here's another way of saying the same thing: a translator's task is giving up. Rendering, and very often rending, each time wrenching. Caught in an intractable double bind, immemorial and infinitely iterated, one must decide or rule, it faut trancher, right where the idiomatic snarl won't be untied. It means giving up the dream of an effortless and silent living transfusion, immediate and unmitigated, unmediated. Giving up giving, in other words, because in the first place the thing does not belong to you, and in the second it will not in any case have been handed over intact. But giving, nonetheless. Getting and begetting. Forgiving, perhaps forgiven. Giving forgetting too. And yet translation is so eminently plausible, what's more it happens all the time. A mechanical game of correspondences, in sum, an inexorable machine. Because nothing escapes, there's not a one. Die Anton Apocalyptique Adopnagware and Philosophie, Paris, Galilee, 1983, p.10. Single word that can't be taken, by ruse or by force. Which does not mean that all translations are equally faithful or captivating. There are inevitably trade-offs along the way and never an end in sight. Set in motion, the mutational process stops for no one. So while its transgressive lure may be formally irresistible, there is no definitive translation, by definition. At some point one simply has to give up. Period. Things are hardly better for the reader, of course. Willy-nilly, and mutatis mutandis, a translation's readers are inscribed into a position of absolute dissymmetry and heteronomy, p. 41, as Derrida says of a boy being circumcised, of Freud's phantom to whom Yerushalmi proclaims shall say we, and of anyone addressed by anyone else, you read something you cannot read, in any case something you will not have read once you're done reading. Like an infant who can neither comprehend nor respond. And while an author may be a reader's ghost, in translation the text itself is presented without being present, it is here and yet there. A translation is irresponsible, unreliable, deceptive. Yet imposing. Authoritarian if not authoritative. It inevitably inflicts an irresistible covenant. Whereas a foreign text in the original leaves the reader free, because the reader is not a reader, the text being foreign and thus legibly illegible for those who have not domesticated the other mother tongue. It does not suppose and impose a we, because to begin with it says we differently, that is, it literally does not say we. Rather, and precisely because translation always remains possible, it inscribes the limits, the singularity, or the extraordinary common to any we. And so a translation does violence at once to the text to which it offers an ambiguous hospitality, both becking and balking, and to the reader, it takes something foreign and makes something familiar, readable at least, and thereby imposes the indivisible community of a homolinguistic we. Here, these violences can perhaps be excused, for we must read Derrida, and well. However, they tend to conceal another one that is more pernicious while not wholly unpropitious. Whatever it may change, a translation maintains above all its own fiction, it maintains the true fiction that translation is possible. It is this fiction, both hopeful and frightening, promising communication where none by definition should be possible, and simultaneously eliminating the possible communication of difference itself, so to speak, regarding difference, or of its incommunicability, and so effacing a vital, ineffable otherness proffered by the other idiom. Even so, things are more complicated. For translation is very much at work within Derrida's French texts, the question, the problem, or the concept, but also the act of translation with its textual effects and defects. For instance, at a certain point, p. 75, Derrida discusses a passage in Yerushalmi where the expression dramatic evidence figures in the English original. In his French text, p. 120, Derrida uses the translation evidence dramatique in quotation marks. Though evidence and evidence are cognates, the translation is problematic because the French word signifies primarily something obvious, such that the French phrase alone would tend to translate more like dramatic obviousness than dramatic evidence. So in the French, Derrida follows this translation with the English in parentheses, and then a chain of alternate translations or translation modifiers, proof, mark, clue, testimony, archive. These words serve to correct the translation, reorienting the sense of evidence to better approximate the meaning of evidence, so many linguistic exhibits displayed to incriminate the felicity of such a unitary accounting for this uncountable noun. How to translate the sequence from Mal d'Archive into English? The correct solution would no doubt have been to restore in a word the dramatic evidence of Yerushalmi's text, rendering 5 lines of French into English words. And yet this approach too would have been guilty of economic infidelity, because in the momentum of its verbose rendition, the French translation is not simply a translation. It displaces, replaces as a translation must, and in the commotion it says more, it does more, it goes further in translation, while at no point ceasing to translate. And of course a translation I-107 is a going further, going beyond the idiomatic limitations that are the very condition of linguistic expression, of signification, of anything called culture. Strictly speaking it is quite impossible, since it must at once follow behind and forge ahead. So I brought dramatic evidence out of the parentheses, dropped evidence dramatique, and put a translation of the sequence modifying, challenging, reinforcing the translation of evidence as evidence in parentheses. While this has the advantage of maintaining the multiplicity and some of the hermeneutic effect of Derrida's translation in pentimento, it falsifies the role and motivation, thus also the meaning of what is here a parenthetical correction or suggestion, but which is devoid of any reference to translation and to the fertile discrepancy between evidence and evidence. It is out of place at the very least, if inoffensive, evidently misconstrued. The obvious counterexample arises in the several places where French phrases have been kept in French in this English translation. Where they have been translated into English as French or in French in English. Untranslated in the translation, translated as untranslatable yet translated all the same. Page 78, L on se fate violence. The one makes itself violence. In a strange though entirely workaday heterolingual mice and abim, these two sentences translate the first one of themselves. They may not succeed very well, but neither one, alone, would have sufficed. In fact, the second sentence, which is a sort of word-for-word transposition of the first, serves rather as an aid for reading the French in light of what follows. Because the true translation of the sentence already followed it in the French edition, it violates and does violence to itself, but it also institutes itself as violence. As I have translated it here. One might prefer to call it an intralingual explication, which would not be false, but this is also a translation, crossing the internal boundaries of the language, letting its foreignness make themselves at home, the text opening to its domestic outside, p. 19, as Derrida says in reference to the psyche. So even the documented originality of an archive cannot cleanse it of such corruption. An archive may always be in the process of translating to itself and from itself, by itself. Hence one reason why the archive always holds a problem for translation, why it is at once offered and unavailable for translation, p. 90. However, there is another brand of translation, one that is more originary, some would say more metaphorical too, and which bears in it the very possibility of any hope for the transfigurative folly that goes by this name. An edifying artifice, the remains too. But a metaphor is also a translation. Only the question of economy carries a different weight. The one's loss may well be the other's gain. Of a singular event which should naturally leave nothing of itself behind, an archive is there for those who cannot communicate with such a solipsistic solitude in the presence and the present of its untimely happening. For while an archive may not be an end, it is only a beginning. It is not the beginning, and it never contains its own beginning. It can only be a translation of its conception. This is what is recounted by the preamble, what is put into practice there. The archive of such an inimitable occurrence, its place of consignation in the form of a brief interlude between excerpt and foreword, the preamble is in fact a lengthy inscription of the retrospective contents of an instant of no duration, p. 26. Its pages unfold a unitary and timeless event with an explication in 3 wordy meanings. On the telephone, during a conversation, but was it in French or in English, about the title of a lecture that was yet to be written, the word impression imposed itself as by its own volition, automatically. This is indeed the paradigm of translation's universal shortcomings, that is, its spatial and temporal thriftlessness, its literal disproportion. Because, while there may be correlation between an event and its textual relation, there is unfailingly strict incommensuration. Translation always operates at an economic loss. Point 3. In other words, the only thing that is properly untranslatable is idiomatic economy itself. Yet Derrida also warns against holding the technical prosthesis to be a secondary and accessory exteriority, p. 92, against blind confidence in the possibility of a simple archaeology of the archive, through which the archive might disappear into thin air so as to let the origin present itself in person. Live, without mediation and without delay. Without even the memory of a translation, once the intense work of translation has succeeded, p. 93.4. Because when the stones begin talking to set things straight in Freud's X cave of 1109-3. See note is, pages 78 to 79. Here too, an extemporaneous if not instantaneous response is clarified in 3 discrete remarks. For it seems impertinent to ask whether this memory which we may thus expect to be implicated in anything like an encounter with anything like an origin comes under mneme, under anamnesis, or under hypomema. This must be a memory from before the division into different types of memories, an impure memory of the impurity of an origin. Lititional reverie, it is as if the archaeologist had succeeded in putting the archivist out of work. And the translator too, of course. Yet these stones are archives, and everyone knows that archives do not speak. Not even answering machines. Only the living answer. And what is more, in Freud's scenario, these archives turn out to be bilingual, they are themselves already translations of themselves, they speak a dead language and a living one, Greek and German for example, a bit like Hanold in his encounter with Gradova, or at least a dead and forgotten dead language and a less dead one which will permit them in turn to be deciphered and translated, p. 93. So these stones, archives yielding undreamed of information about the events of the remote past, can hardly be taken for pure archel. If the archaeological discoveries are self-explanatory, it is only insofar as they already reflect a prodigious amount of archival toil, and not at all because the events they record could talk without archivization. It is certainly not without significance that they should be hybrid, dead/living, ghostly. That stones, which ought to be dead, should talk, which only the living ought to do, nor that this event should be reenacted, performed in a particular way here, where the stones talk, in italics, with an exclamation point, and above all in Latin, the dead language living in Freud's own hybrid text. For if archive fever can be written down to an instant, it is the instant or the instantaneous event as overdetermination. In other words, impure, exceeding itself, uncontained, calling for its archivization because already containing the seeds of its own archive. Divided in, and of itself. Calling but not necessarily answering for its archive. Because one can scarcely believe that when called upon as if to bear witness to its singularity or its originality, to the original singularity that it is, an event any more than a living being ever responds in an absolutely living and infinitely well-adjusted manner, without the least automatism, without ever having an archival technique overflow the singularity of an event. p. 62. Without some answering machine effect, some spectrality in the response and thus dead in the living. Which is to say that the impression, the unique moment of archivization, produces as much as it records the event, p. 17, while nonetheless being the condition of its potential repetition, it never neutrally consigns a pre-existent archivable content in a simple manner. Conversely, insofar as it is archivable, an event is always archiving, an event is an archiving act even if there may not be a proper archive and even if the archive of an event, as its interpretation, must always remain open. And this is where the question of archival technology is so significant, for it conditions, the impression, before the division between printed and printer, p. 18. What is the printed here? Is it the archive, or the printed content, i.e. what is archived? And is the printer the event that leaves its imprint, that is archived, or the structure that prints? Yes, beforehand we do not know. There is the foot and there is the ash. But as great of a soul, or Hanold's for that matter, or so many others, touches the ground, the foot, the leg, the ash, and the earth below serve together as a sort of machine, a momentary printing press that will leave the archive even as it disappears forever. And this is the truth of the event of course, the true event of the event, neither material nor historical, before the division, as the living and the dead may mingle their steps, and we'll never know for sure who's who or what's what. Right on the ash, Derrida says, even if it makes no sense. And, la centromeme.